G'day guys. This is a follow-up on a video that I did earlier this year covering sort of the situation with the banks, particularly the US banks, and sort of the pressures there in the small to medium-sized sort of banks. I sort of warned about a couple of them that were under risk and all that. Things have since then have really intensified. All of those smaller banks have come under massive pressure. So, I mean, people that are in the US probably are well aware of that. Some people in Europe are well aware of some financial organizations there that have come under pressure or been weakened. There's been a bit of geopolitics, like with Credit Suisse, because it was involved with Nord Stream 1 and 2 in financing it. So obviously the US did a bit of financial warfare there. The Arabs realized that was happening, so they pulled out their support. They were going to have a proxy war with their finances. So, you know, it was to be expected. So there's some shenanigans that have happened, but generally speaking, the sort of stuff in the US is due to higher interest rates. It's just simple as that, you know. First Republic Bank is still, you know, in the doldrums, as many people know in the US. There's a lot of pressure on many of the others as well. As people pull out their money out of these institutions, or investors try and pull out and stuff like that, what happens is, the problem is a lot of these companies are holding a lot of bonds, which are like 10-year bonds. And this is where the problem lies, that a number of these organizations bought far too many bonds at these low interest rate levels. And as interest rates have been rising, bonds go the other way. So bond values have been dropping. So the reality is, when they need to, if you hold it to maturity, it's not a problem, because you'll just basically cash in the coupon, you'll get your money, and you would have got an interest rate payment for the period that you held those bonds. So the government of the US, for instance, would be paying you on those coupons. So, but if you're in need of liquidity and you're under a lot of pressure with people wanting their money, or wanting to divest, or wanting to get access to their dollars, well, then the quickest way of actually is, cashing in, pretty much selling those bonds and getting less for them, which really puts you in a massive loss as a consequence. I'll give you an example. If you go back to about January 2022, the US 10-year bond was about, around about 1%. In Germany, for instance, the 10-year bond was about minus half of a percent, ridiculously low. They were in negative interest rates in the Eurozone at the time. So it was just crazy economics in that place. But it was just a continuation of that, where the Fed put into circulation through central bank lending that additional $14 trillion. So they pushed money out to try and actually shore up a number of other central banks that they have relationships with, and that sort of amplified the situation. It's not as if these people didn't know, so I know a lot of these people, you'll hear the central bankers, they'll come out and they'll go, we weren't expecting this inflation, we weren't. Bullshit. I'll give you a bit of a hint why this is bullshit. The Bank of International Settlements, so that's you could say, the bank of all that actually deals with all the central banks of the world. So they are the people that Even in war times, they will deal between even warring countries and their central banks and make sure that all transactions, like you've got the SWIFT and you've got all these different sort of bank transacting systems, make sure that all settlements happen according to those international standards and nobody's ripping off anyone and, money isn't going where it shouldn't go. So they basically keep an eye on all these, on risk, on emerging risks and stuff like that. Well, back in October of 2018, I suspect that was before COVID, before the Ukrainian war, before what else? All this sort of inflation and all that. Well, what were they saying? They were actually warning the central banks of a dangerous emerging risks. That's what they were saying. They were saying, look, there's just too much, money printing. There's too much. This was in 2018, October 2018. And there are not the reforms that are required to stabilize the international banking system since the crisis of 2008. So they were warning them that, that a decade's gone past and really the sort of changes that were required, the reining in of this, spendthrift sort of really governments just keep on printing and just spending like there's no tomorrow, like drunken sailors. This needs to be reined in. It just was getting completely out of hand. Pretty much they were ignored in that regard. So no one can actually sit there and say, oh, we had no idea. Bullshit. Absolutely bullshit. They were actually told by the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, so the Fed knows, the RBA in Australia knows, the ECB knows, the Bank of Japan knows. All these institutions were told about this emerging risk due to inflation. They were warned. They were saying, look, inflation is building up in the system. They could see it because, oh, what happened? Oh, that's right. Back in 20, the old saying, go woke and go broke. In 2014, there was a lot of pressure by a lot of these woke institutions to, to basically stop investing in petrochemicals. Wasn't there, boys and girls? Yes. And, about 4 years later, they had noticed that there was growing inflation in the system. The cost of energy was going up. Remember the energy potentiality in the system? That's what really is money. Real wealth is energy. Now you can monetize it with something which holds its store of value, which is gold or silver, but real is fundamentally at the fundamental level. That means being able to mine that gold or mine that silver, which is real money in my book. At the end of the day, you need energy. So energy underpins everything. And as energy prices were going up, and as the cost of energy was increasing, and they could see it, and the competition for access to energy was also increasing, and the availability, the uncertainty in investment in new energy sources was, let's say, there was a lot of question marks on it. They pretty much said, well, we've got a problem. They could see that there was rising underlying inflation growing, and they were doing projections. What if investments in these energy forms remains at similar level, and replacements like renewable bullshit can't keep up? Well, obviously we know that it can't keep up. There's just not enough mines to provide the materials to build the batteries and the windmills and the solar farms. That's the reality. And let alone the amount of energy it costs you more in energy to build these things than the energy they return before they become obsolete and you have to bury them somewhere. And then they become a waste management nightmare. You know, this is the problem, that these people, these complete and utter wonky idiots, are basically causing us, especially the West. You know, we are the ones that actually are in this really severe spiral of debt. You know, we've basically put ourselves in a debt trap. I'll explain further how this all happened. It's really interesting. But anyway, let's move on. So pretty much, you know, when we look at the risk profile of like Mexico, for instance, this is for sort of unsecuritized sort of type holdings. The US is about 660. Mexico's about 610, 615. You know, things are not as they used to be. America used to have a much better unsecured sort of risk profile than what it has at the moment. You know, obviously, because we've got this quite a lot of money printing, which has caused a lot of problems. And this happened both under the Republican and the Democrat watch through the COVID period and after the COVID period and prior to it as well. So nobody can get scot-free and say, oh, we didn't do it. No, you all did it. A lot of yous, and you basically passed legislation to do it in that regard. So nobody gets off scot-free on this one. And that's in America, let alone in most other countries. The major political parties were all in unanimous agreement through these periods as well, printing money like drunken sailors, like there was no tomorrow. I mean, you know, we know that even in Australia, for instance, a country that's got, you know, 1 point, I think, what's our GDP now? I think it's 1.7 odd or whatever trillion. You know, we still manage to sort of print about at 1.4, I think, or slightly more, probably higher now. So, you know, there was plenty of cash money for those who wanted to stay at home and play computer games. Oh, we had to avoid the virus, even though it, you know, actually those who died from it were far lower than some of the worst flu pandemics, thanks to basically, even though it was, let's say, an invention of some very interesting people in Wuhan. At the end of the day, so the story goes from the US authorities now. That's all I'm confirming. It still killed less from the actual issue in the UK than what the flu pandemic of 89, 90 that killed more. And that was a smaller population and a population which was younger with less comorbidities. So these people went crazy, maybe because they realized it was a really nasty, nasty bug that was invented and they knew. Maybe that's why they went crazy, you know. And, you know, these gain of function beauties that they like to invent. But luckily, evolution helped out. And by the time it really got to become a super spreader, it sort of became benign or even less riskier. Then it evolved into something less riskier to get around. So, but the damage was done, severe damage to the supply chains. You know, the supply chains still haven't recovered. So you've got a massive hit to the supply chains, which means that goods and services, you know, getting things moving on the trade part is still problematic. And on top of that, you've got the lack of cheap energy. So all these things have come together to create a sort of an avalanche of inflationary pressure. But I don't think even the Bank of International Settlements back in October 2018 thought that it would get this bad. We're talking about it's really bad, guys. It's really bad. Even the major institutions, if things really unravel, even the major institutions are stuffed. I'll give you an example. When it comes to, sort of total sort of bonds, paper, mortgages, the whole lot, the whole gamut that can be affected by, very high interest rates and massive defaults. Let's take Deutsche Bank in Germany, 42 trillion euros. Did you hear that? 42 trillion euros. That's bigger than the German economy. That's bigger than the Eurozone. That's bigger than the entire European Union. JP Morgan, 53 trillion. Okay? So you can actually understand that, you think 2008 was bad? You ain't seen nothing yet. And this sort of nightmare is coming to a home near you this summer. It's not very far. I can see this really unraveling, towards the end of summer, maybe in the early parts of autumn, going pear-shaped big time. I'm not kidding you. This time, I made a prediction years ago, back in about 2025 being the big, like we reinflate the economy each time, and then eventually we have this big crescendo, 80 to 100 years of where we just can't reinflate things anymore. It's done. We're maxed out. We've maxed out the credit card. We can no longer go and keep on going on that front, and things really go pear-shaped at that stage. So happened before in 29, happened in the middle of the 19th century. It was called the Long Recession. So happens every 80 to 100 years. This time it would have happened much earlier. Technically, if things had played out without funny money, it would have happened in 2008, which is what I was predicting at the time. And then people said, well, you didn't get this right. And then I said, well, they started doing funny money. But I said that I did some projections, and my own projection said 2025, they can keep on money printing, doing QE, but by 2025, it's all going to go pear-shaped. They won't be able to sustain it, because it's pretty much, it gets a momentum of itself on its own, that you start really pushing so much liquidity into the system, everybody goes crazy, because it's just greed pushing asset prices up like mad. All asset classes start getting pushed up because people are just they just go on a binge, a profiteering binge. And that's exactly what happened and has been happening. And then these underlying other issues that have come in to bring it 2 years earlier. But it was going to happen anyway, at some stage. So this sort of negative interest rates and this sort of QE type thing, that these sort of, let's say, creative sort of approaches that they came up with that have never been tried before. And it was quite clear that they would fail, in a sense. The only way that they got away with such a long period of time compared to the past, because the past usually comes in much way earlier. Like if you go back to the long recession and then before that, those crises came in much earlier. To a large extent, the reason why we've been able to build up such a mountain, an absolute horrendous mountain of debt, is quite simply put cheap energy and technological advancement. That means we've actually had the capacity to produce goods and services far cheaper while debasing our currency and hiding that inflation, that real inflation. I mean, the US currency has been debased more than 90% since the early part of the 20th century. It's been massively debased. But because, for the simple fact of cheap energy, petrochemicals, the carbon stuff that most of these woke people don't like, it's because of that they were able. But you know what? The people didn't win out of that. It was the big end of town that became multiple billionaires by, being able to increase the money supply. So the dollar that you work for gets devalued every time. It's, you might as well just go over to these elites and just basically hand over half your paycheck, because that's what you're doing continuously. That's really what it's all about. This whole reason of getting off a gold standard, of not having money discipline, is so you can inflate asset prices massively. That's how the rich become richer. This is why back in the 50s and 60s, after the Second World War, when some of those agreements of Bretton Woods, no bankers were invited, obviously, and we had a situation of real, close to real money, in a sense, backed by gold at $35 an ounce, and pretty much kept the system honest. And it also meant that a middle-class person was getting value as the, productivity and the cheaper energy was flooding the system through the late 40s into the 50s and 60s. The production of goods and services became cheaper. So for the first time in many people's lives, these working people became middle class. They could afford a fridge, they could afford a TV, they could afford a home, not only for themselves, but for their kids as well, on one salary. Got it? And then we had Thatcherism or Reaganomics, where we are unleashed, we got rid of all the controls off the banks slowly but surely. We came off the gold standard completely and utterly, and pretty much allowed the money printing to go mad. And that's when all those, in the 80s, those billionaires started emerging, those extremely wealthy parasites. They were basically taking other people's productive endeavor. So people who worked and produced goods and services had that value that they were adding to the real economy being taken away from them by the currency being debased. So they were losing. So whatever productivity and whatever competitiveness they produced in a product got siphoned away by these elites, these financial elites. And slowly but surely, what happened was the West became undermined in terms of productivity. And, on top of that, these people took away that wealth and then invested it overseas and destroyed the jobs of the people who created that wealth for them. Talk about, compounding, the assault on the common man. But that's what happened, pretty much. I have very little respect for either Reagan or Thatcher because they were the banker's best friend. All the neocons and all these people that emerged from them on both sides of politics. They were just basically a bunch of corrupt individuals who just were looking at profiteering at the expense of the productivity of good business people and their workers. Those who are trying to develop productive activities in the economy were the ones being penalized, while the, financiers who were profiteering from cheap credit and inflating assets, basically just building up their Ponzi scheme of debt, these people being rewarded. That's the system we actually decided to make. And they used the excuse of the oil crisis, where energy became expensive and inflation went up. And they said, oh, we have to. By the stage they actually started pulling all these measures away for unshackling the banks. By that time, most of the crisis, had gone away because the Arabs started pumping oil again and supplying the West. But it's so different than this time, the inflation that's come due to also not only from money printing, but also from expensive energy. And that's being caused by two things. One, the European Union and the US and Canada are unwilling to invest in energy in their own economies, in carbon-based energy, and pretty much have made themselves either dependent on foreign sources. I don't know how the carbon coming from Russia or the carbon coming from Venezuela or the carbon coming from Saudi Arabia is different than the carbon they could actually get out of their own ground. What the difference is, the amount that it puts in the atmosphere is no different. So that's just a ludicrous argument. There's no argument. It's just ridiculous. But the consequences of that is that it basically causes inflation in our own economies, in the Western economies primarily. But also it affects other economies in Asia and elsewhere. Why does it affect them? Because the moment the West underinvests, but has the capacity, the financial capacity currently, maybe in the future it won't, but currently has the financial capacity to compete for that more expensive oil and gas, what it means is it also, the poorer nations in Asia and Africa, they struggle. And then when they want, no wonder they're going to China. Why are they going to China? Because China's willing to give them the credit so they can actually develop their own petrochemical and also coal mines in their country. That's what, countries like South Africa are doing and a number of others. They're going, well, you guys are all woke. You're not going to lend us money. You're putting conditions. China's willing to give us so we can build our energy, so we can actually provide cheap energy for our people. I take my hat off to them. Bravo. Good on yous. That's what they have to do. That's what the West and other countries need to do. Every country. They need to jettison all this nonsense and start investing in energy. There's not an easy way out of this debt trap. Now, obviously, you can actually go, we'll just basically just, who cares? Some people say. I'll give you an example. In the US at the moment, you've got the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, at war, pretty much, with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen over China. I think also the Commerce Secretary, Gina, whatever her name is, I can't Can't remember her name. I think it starts with an R, her surname. But anyway, they're at war. You know, the cabinet, the pretty much the Biden cabinet is not a very happy place currently. You know, Janet wants to go over to China to talk about the bonds, yes, because, you know, for instance, and this is where all the sort of stress over the debt ceiling being to rise from, you know, the current, which is 31.5% approximately, to 33%. And obviously there are politicians in the US that are currently saying, no, 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 we're not going to do that unless there are cuts here and cuts there and whatever. So they're haggling over cuts, where the cuts should be. What they don't realise is the cuts are unimportant. Even if you cut the budget here or there by a small amount, it's not going to make much of a difference. This is nonsense. This is just a typical bullshit from Republicans and Democrats, one fighting over money spent on arms and other things, and the other being spent on health, social security, and stuff like that. At the end of the day, none of this really matters. If you've got cheap energy, you can drive these debt levels down. I mean, I'll give you an example. The US after the Second World War had a debt to GDP of 244%. By the 1950s, it was nearly zero. Why? Why was it nearly zero? They had printed shitloads of money to fight the Second World War. So why were they able to reduce their debts back down to close to zero by the 1950s? I mean, that's about less than a decade. I think it was close to 53 or around about there. Can't remember. Don't hold me to it. So what? It can't be done? Bullshit. You start mining and getting all the petrochemicals out and flooding the US economy with cheap money, really cheap, cheap energy, and do what Trump wanted to do, which is bring back a lot of US manufacturing and start producing goods and services, competitively goods and services, and start building the export potential of Europe. Europe, basically, Germany should be basically financing the oil extraction within the Aegean, within the Eastern Mediterranean, so within the exclusive economic zones of Greece and Cyprus. And they should be willing to send military ships and assets to defend those European borders and stop basically kissing Erdogan's ass, who just basically likes to blackmail Europe. That's the only reason why he doesn't, you know, is no different than Putin in using the blackmail option. But the idiots in Berlin don't seem to get it. You know, that's the problem. They need to wake up to themselves. They need to defend European interests, and they need to start extracting. There is shitloads of coal, oil and gas within the Eurozone to provide a lot of cheap energy, which will pretty much bring down inflation substantially and stabilize the Eurozone, and then lift the productivity of the Eurozone, allowing for exports to be competitively with the rest of the world to provide improvements in the economic potential of the continent. So people can do it. They have done it in the past. They can do it again. The problem is that with the current thinking in Berlin, in Washington, it's not going to happen. Somebody needs to take a solar panel and hit them over the head. Maybe that will knock some sense into them, because nothing else will. These people are crazy. They've lost their marbles. You know, I mean, in the US, interest payments on the debt, the US debt, currently, I mean, in 2021, it was about 350 approximately. It's not, don't hold me to it. I'm giving approximate values now, billion, where they had, the coupon payments on US bonds and treasuries. Now, what is it now? 1.3 trillion because of the higher interest rates. This is why there's pressure on raising the debt ceiling. Pretty much the debt ceiling should be raised because you don't want to default. Default actually causes bigger problems. The way to get out of this problem isn't by fighting over how much you're going to spend here or there on a shrinking pie. You need to grow the pie, not shrink it with expensive energy. That's the problem. At the end of the day, you can take out everything. You can take out the entire military budget of the US. It's still, you're going to be in a difficult spot. The problem is the US is uncompetitive. Europe is uncompetitive due to expensive energy. And now because of higher amounts of money printing, the debt to GDP is much higher. But you can actually shrink the debt to GDP by increasing total income. How do you increase total income? That's by growing the GDP, the gross domestic product. How do you do that? By basically starting to manufacture and being able to do that, to basically produce wealth in the country, you need cheap energy. You need to start fracking. You need to start pulling oil, gas, uranium, everything. You need to throw everything in the mix to try and provide sufficient cheap energy to deal with this crisis. This crisis can't be dealt with any other way. People are deluded if they think it can be dealt with any other way. All these other fights and all that are irrelevant. If things go pear-shaped, really things will go really bad. At the moment, Janet Yellen wants to go to China, and she's trying to tell Blinken, calm down, mate, calm down. I'm trying to do a deal with the creditors before we end up in really bad waters. So what she's trying to do is go there and tell them, look, let's do a bit of a deal, or let's do a reschedule on payments or whatever. So I don't know exactly what she's going over there, all the details, but she's probably going to do something like that. I know Roosevelt in the 30s, he basically went to the overseas creditors and said, look, we'll pay you in gold, pay you out in gold. And he said to the domestic creditors, look, all the people that were holding the domestic bonds, he said, look, we're going to have a bit of a freeze on payments for six months, or some arrangement, in order to basically allow the US to stabilize. So you can do something like that again, but it requires vision. It requires somebody who's not demented, and it requires people that don't want to kill each other in Congress and in the Senate, but actually want to sit down and say, let's come up with a solution to stabilize the situation. And let's look at what works and what doesn't, and stop playing politics, this bullshit. That's what's really required. Otherwise things could really go awry. Obviously, China, she's probably going to go to Japan as well. The reality is that a lot of these players are already starting to move away, de-dollarize. They're already, the end of the dollar is coming, whether the US likes it or not. The US has to decide whether it's going to prepare its citizens and its society for the end of the dollar. I'll give you an example. China, for instance, its holdings were a couple of years back, quite a few years back, it had about a number of trillions of dollars in US paper. Slowly but surely, they've been, getting out of the dollar. So they've been selling, I think their treasuries, bond holdings, and any other, I think it's below 900 billion. I can't exactly remember. I think it's 800. No, I just can't remember it. Anyway, so between last year, they actually sold something like well over 120 odd billion. So they offloaded that, and they purchased well over 1,000 metric tons of gold. So there was a bit of an increase of well over 152%, or 152% approximately, increase between 2021 and 2022. So that's a massive increase in gold, purchases. So obviously they want to, whatever the BRICS come up with, they want to create some sort of international exchange or a settlement system that is backed by gold. And that's why a lot of their central banks are buying gold like there's no tomorrow. That's why I'm telling you, well, to consider that. It's not for me to I'm not providing any financial advice. I'm just telling you what the situation is. I think if I was in your shoes, I would basically truly consider, a good example. Back in 2021, gold versus bonds was about 90 to 92% difference. Now, gold has gone up and bonds have lost value. So that number is quite substantial and increasing the difference. So they're less a one-to-one and more different between, which is really telling you that fiat money is losing value rapidly and gold is becoming the new money, the future money. Something that I've told people for a long time, but people have just basically looked at me and gone, really? Some people, one of my friends does, did heed it even more than me. So he's doing very well. Thank you very much. But others, yes. The biggest problem at the moment is that most of the Western economies are falling into this sort of rapidly falling into this debt trap. It's because a lot of them, just bought a lot of these long-term bonds, 10-year bonds at 1%, or like in Germany, minus half of a percent, at the time. And a lot of these they've had losses between 15 and 20% in the US on bonds. I can't remember the exact figure. It's slightly higher in Germany, or in the Eurozone, to be more precise. I should be calling it the Eurozone. And in the US on stocks, it's about 15%. It's sort of, a 1.75 trillion, losses in terms of bonds. So quite a lot of money. Yes. There are many economies that are not that big. So we're talking about a substantial effect. And because of the Dodd-Frank what is it called, the Wall Street reforms for protecting consumers or something like that. And because of that, obviously there's a number of these smaller institutions, there's less protection. So you can expect haircuts, like severe haircuts, as things get worse. So there's going to be mounting losses, and they will have an escalating effect over time, which is the biggest problem. The reality is that, guys, things are getting a bit more precarious, and people should really consider what's coming. The high interest rates are going to be pushing, mortgages into uncharted territory. And unlike in the 2008, where you had the more risky end, like the subprime and things like that, that really were the ones, now it seems it's systemic. Because you've got the problem here that this rapid rise in interest rates because of inflation that we've caused because of our woke agenda and money printing, rapid money printing, has actually caused this mountain of inflation to burst on the scenes in such a short amount of time, where the supply chains are still in a mess. Energy, cheap energy is hard to get, which is accelerating. And you can't actually, you've got the one hand, you're trying to fight inflation with higher interest rates, but you're also making the ability for governments to make payments to their bondholders very problematic, nearly impossible in some cases. And so if you allow for a deflationary effect, it'll just exacerbate the problem. So let's say we have, we're just continually going up on interest rates to try and actually force a deflation to sort of break the back of that and see the collapse of a number of sectors of the economy to shrink the economy. What that will do is that will amplify, because GDP will contract, total income will contract, or the activity in the economy. So debt to GDP will just blow out like mad. And once that happens, the ability to service your debt becomes nearly impossible, and you start defaulting. And then we've got mass defaults across the world, and sovereigns that are no longer able to shore up their own banks and other sectors. So you can see that we're in a debt trap. So if you keep on going up that way, problem. If you go the other way, you let it fall apart, problem. You're basically caught in a trap of your own making. Now, is there a way out? There is. Cheap energy. Cheap friggin' energy. We need to stop this war in the Ukraine as fast as possible. And the thing is, things are not looking good for the Ukrainian military. It'll probably all come to an end anyway around summer. It may actually even happen earlier. If, for instance, there's a massive bank crisis in the US is going to have so many problems, it'll just jettison the Ukraine issue altogether, like they did with Afghanistan. And basically, the Russians will just deal with the problem. And so that'll be all over. I would say to the Polish people and Poles, careful what you get involved, because your politicians seem to want to get more deeper involved. Remember what Kissinger said about the US. If there's no nuclear exchange between the US and Russia, even if US says, because remember, NATO is the US. Without the US, there is no NATO. So this so-called umbrella is a Ponzi scheme. It's another one of those things. As long as the US needs Europe, yeah, fine. But at the moment, it doesn't need it anymore. Well, you're on your own, aren't you? As Kissinger said back then. So let alone now that there is an potential existential threat. Unless there are nukes raining over US cities, the US isn't going to basically undertake an exchange just because Warsaw gets blown up. So careful what, your next steps are, because your politicians are reckless, completely reckless, and they need to be overthrown because of their recklessness. Because they're putting, So get out there, start protesting that you don't want to have anything to do with the Ukrainian conflict, and you need to basically, the next elections, get rid of them as soon as possible. And if there are elections, and you can get rid of them more effectively, as I said, I don't believe in, I'm not a proponent of violence. I'm talking about peaceful protests and overthrowing them peacefully. They did it in, there were many sort of peaceful uprisings in Eastern Europe under the Soviet system. You know how to do it. You've done it before. You can bring these governments down. Just stop doing everything. Just say, we're not going to work. We're not going to do anything. Bugger off. What are they going to do? They can't run a country that doesn't want to be run. So you need to make some choices, because you could be obliterated. You've been parroting the Biden administration bullshit, and now you may be abandoned this summer if things really go haywire, especially if Janet Yellen comes back with a deal with the Chinese. So potentially you could be goodbye, Poland and Baltic states. That could happen to you. So wake up to yourselves. We're not talking about giving in to Russia, but at the same time, there's no advantage basically poking the bear. And for the life of me, I can't even understand why Sweden and Finland basically want to poke the bear as well. They've gone insane as well. They've had security through being neutral, no different than Austria is neutral, no different than Switzerland. And even there's some stupid politicians that want to break Swiss neutrality. There's a lot of advantages in having, there's a couple of geopolitical experts in the past, and even some Americans that were very enlightened, that understood that it's good to have buffer states between major powers, because those buffer states, sort of a barrier, making it harder for, it lowers the tension. When you're on somebody else's border and you're at striking distance, it really raises the tension, and that's how mistakes can happen. We don't need that. Europe's lost, millions and millions of people through 2 world wars. You don't need to lose any more. Wake up to yourselves. The insanity needs to stop. There's more advantage. I mean, the Soviet Union isn't there anymore. It's Russia. Russia is not the Soviet Union. I mean, Putin actually wanted to join NATO at one stage and the European Union. You said, go bugger off. You could have actually given him a partnership for peace. You could have made another deal, another sort of deal, an arrangement. And that basically would have provided guarantees for his security, for his people, and for the Euro, and for the EU as well. Things didn't need to escalate to this level. These hawks, the Norlands, the Blinkens of this world, the Bidens of this world, these lunatics that basically want to just keep the military-industrial war machine going, is the biggest problem. We can't afford it anymore on this planet to basically be feeding the beast, because that's what we're doing. We're feeding the beast. At the same time, with this woke behavior that the West is doing, we're weakening ourselves. By 2035, the BRIC nations, their GDP is going to be higher. It's projected to be higher than that of the G7. And the G7 is the West. Basically, the West will be dethroned as the principal economic force on this planet. And all because of wokeism. All this modern stupid agendas, that are being pushed like mad by these lunatic elites in the West, these big financiers who want to push the transhuman agenda because they want to live forever. They don't care about the West anymore or its position in the world. This is the fight that we've got on our hands. We need to sweep away this political class with new people that are going to basically deal with these bastards, basically. That's pretty much it, guys. It's not an easy task, but it has to be done. In societies, let me explain to you, there are three elite groups. There's a political elite, there's a financial elite, and there's the military elite. Always has been from the beginning of civilization. Even in tribal societies, you had a bit of, the chief and the hunters. But then it was pretty much the entire tribe. Now these are smaller groups within the society. But that's really how it sort of works in that regard. So when things become, let's say, difficult, the political class, as long as they're getting from their rich patrons, they'll do their misanthropic deeds and wishes. They'll implement their transhuman agenda. But the moment they realise that they could lose votes, well, there's not enough money to keep them in power, is there? Money won't keep them in power if the people have switched off on them completely. So that's when they become popularists. And that's when they turn on some of these people. Or some of these people then realise, I'm not going to get my way. I need to support the populist to basically avoid being, they'll come with pitchforks. Got it? And then if the political class and the financial class really send things into a spiral, it's usually the military class that will intervene to prevent a complete collapse. Not that they'll do a better job, but at least they may stabilize the country from basically killing each other. But it will create deep psychological wounds and hatreds between the people and the military as a consequence of that. But it's what usually happens, in a sense, between those three elite groups. And it's pretty much the other two try to, let's say, keep them on side because they do have the guns. And it's just the way it works. But at the end of the day, if the majority of people just walk out and just say, nah, bugger, you can't shoot the whole people. Just look at what's happening in Haiti. You've got the police that have sided with the local militias and the local people, and they're going out and taking on the gangs that used to be the squads that used to be employed by the rich to enforce their rule. And now these criminals are being taken on. And the Biden administration is going, I need to save my rich mates down there and politicians, so I need to send in some military and justify it. There is that war in the Ukraine. It's not going to look good. It just doesn't look good intervening. Now, how are we going to sell it? Oh, yes, recently, because the local people are taking the law into their own hands. This awful stuff that's happening there. There's so much bloodshed. It's horrific. So obviously we need to stop it. It's a bit like the Sudan issue. It's another sort of equivalent to the Arab Spring. We need to go in there and save them. Yeah. That's right. We need to stop Wagner from actually getting with the one group getting all that that gold and some of the other resources, and we need to support our mates who are going to hand it over to us. And then you've got the Emiratis also involved in there, trying with the other group, opposed to Egypt. Usually they work together. And then you've got Haftar, even he's involved, the Libyan guy. So yeah, it's a right old mess. Everybody in there because there were resource to be had and all that. So yes, it never ceases to amaze me, some of these sort of things. That's really what's happening in Sudan, just to letting you know. There is one group that's trying to secure the oil reserves and all that, and the other group that's basically being financed through gold, and they're actually shipping it through back to Russia and through the Wagner group as well, that's actually providing them support. So yeah. And the Americans want their cut. That's really what it is. No, actually, it's a new democracy initiative for Sudan, even though none of the people actually even understand what it means. But that's a side issue. Don't concern yourselves, boys and girls. The big boys. Know what they're doing. Yeah. So what's new? All I can say is to my US subs, you guys need to put a blowtorch under your politicians, and you need to tell them you need to basically support US industry, manufacturing, and you need to support cheap energy. We want industrial jobs and cheap energy. That should be the slogan. And you should tell them that, and you should get it around. You should start through your social media and stuff like that, promoting the idea. And the same thing in Europe and in many other parts of the world, because there's resources, there's plenty of cheap energy everywhere. Let's all get it out. Let's get more of the stuff out. Let's make the production of goods and services cheaper. That's what will give us higher living standards. It's what actually eroded all the debt away and gave us higher living standards in the 50s and 60s and onwards. And then we stuffed it all up with not investing sufficiently in energy and money printing because we wanted it on the easy. We didn't want to basically work hard to produce real wealth through productive activity. No, we wanted to basically just print it and inflate it. And that's what we did. And we got away with it for some time. But now it's come back to roost, and it's biting us very hard on the rear end. That's really what's happening. And this is why there's this massive friction. And that's what worries me, because these things don't end very well. When you get to these situations, these debt traps, and countries see no way out, they either make deals or they go to war to reset the system. And that's what worries me, the war part. A global war is the last thing we need. There's a lot of people that died in the last one, well over 50 million. This time, it could be in the billions. So it could be horrendous. That's what worries me. That is why as citizens, for our own survival, our own stake, our own damn interest, for our children, grandchildren, we need to step up. The time to basically sit there and leave it to the politicians and others has finished. We need to step up and basically change the course of our societies. We need to get the message out there through our social media, through our friends, and we need to speak in one language. We need energy, energy, energy. We need shitloads, sounding like Stephanie. Bloody hell. Yes, we need bloody energy, cheap and heaps of it. And if we don't change the course, if we don't stop this woke agenda, there'll be a massive collision between East and West, and a lot of people are going to die. In order to avoid this, and it's in the interest of the East as well, you're not going to get out off this unscathed. If we go down, you'll go down as well. We'll drag you down. There'll be a global conflict because pretty much these elites don't want to lose the privileges that they've got. So the citizens of the West and the citizens of the East need to basically put the pressure, on the one hand, to put the pressure for diplomatic pressure in the East towards the West, and the West, the citizens, to basically start putting the blowtorch under their politicians to jettison this woke agenda completely. We need to reset the system in the way as we sort of did back after the Second World War. And the way we do that is with cheap energy and by bringing manufacturing back with cheap energy, you'll be able to do it. But the first thing, the biggest focus should be on cheap energy, on domestic production. The East doesn't need to do that. They've already got secure contracts from the Middle East and other parts of the world. The BRICS and the OPEC +1 have already made their deals. What the West needs to do is to basically build up its own resources. It needs to become energy independent, completely energy independent. And like it was in the past, after the Second World War, the US was the biggest producer of oil in the world. That cheap oil, through the banking system in London, which eventually became the euro dollar exchange, evolved into it, allowed for a lot of cheap energy to come in from the US into Europe, and eventually then from the Arabs later on. But initially, after the Second World War, it came in from the US. A lot of cheap commodities came in and allowed Europe to basically industrialize and develop. And also for America also to keep on industrializing and developing a consumer economy. And they benefited quite a bit of it. But it was then the adventurism, again, US adventurism in Vietnam and Korea and all that, that eventually made things, and then the oil crisis that really pulled the whole thing apart. Again, people not focusing on the fundamentals and this over exuberance and over confidence, thinking, yes, we can rule and do it as we like. Oh, not really. There are limits to everything. And these people didn't realize the limits of their abilities, and as a consequence, set the West for a fall. That would take a number of decades to happen, but it still happened, or still about to happen anyway, is what I mean, what I should say. If we want to avoid, and we want to do a proper reset, we need to change the cultural thinking and norms. Now, the West went down like the Western Roman Empire, and the Eastern Roman Empire went on for another well over 1,100 years, 1,123, I believe, years. But it went on because it re-established a strong ethical base under orthodoxy at the time. But that was the key underpinning, that pretty much the society where Rome had gone to buggery had literally turned into a small village because of the debauchery of the society that we have today, and that brought a massive collapse. Well, if we want to avoid that, we need to go back. We need to sort out our values in the West rapidly. pretty much we need to put this gender bullshit and the rest of it all to a blowtorch. And we need to convince other people to understand this, that these are the most destructive forces in our society. And if we don't stop them, we will destroy ourselves like the Western Roman Empire did. So people need to heed this and understand this, and we need to get it around for people to get it through their thick skulls that the only way forward is through to re-establish a good ethical base within our society, and we need to basically shut down a lot of these things. You know, OnlyFans and all these other things, ban them. Complete banning of all these things. I'm a person who's believe in free speech. But in societies, there is free speech and there's degeneracy. And as far as I'm concerned, degeneracy has no place in a free society. Okay? Like, you know, you can still have free society, free speech, but you can ban prostitution, you can ban drugs, you can ban criminal behavior. You know, you're not free to go and murder somebody. You're not free to basically smoke, you know, to shoot heroin. You're not free to do a lot of things. Well, you shouldn't be free to basically be able to have, you know, let's say inappropriate things with animals, minors, or anything else that some of these clowns are trying to promote nowadays. This is the reality, guys. You know, this is we're heading, you know, all this crisis is also a crisis of ethics, a crisis of values. You know, these people are saying, oh, everything's relative. You can do whatever you like. You can defecate or piss in public. You can do whatever you like. You could just basically go in and steal somebody's stuff, walk into their homes, walk into their businesses, and do it as you like. This is the problem. You know, there's a complete and utter collapse in the social norms, the acceptable social norms that we've had for thousands of years, that everybody's accepted and lived by. It's what makes a society stable and functional. Once you move out of that and you start allowing all sorts of behaviors, they're all relatively, you know, freedom is not an absolute thing. The freedom of speech is a different thing. To say what you believe and stuff like that in your mind, that I will fight next to you even if I disagree with what you have to say. That's a different thing altogether. But to act on something, that's a different thing. The action is the thing, the unethical action. To make an unethical statement, I don't care. That's your opinion. But to then act on it, it's like people saying, well, you know, these people should be, you know, strung up. Now, obviously, to say that is free speech, but to do it is a crime. You see the difference? So I'm talking about the actions, banning the actions, not the speech. I've got no problems. So free speech is a different thing from freedom of action. Freedom of action, which has a negative effect on someone else, in most civilized societies, is criminal. Now we're taking kids away from parents and altering them, the state itself. I mean, these would have been criminal things in the past. Remember what Germany did? You know, they euthanasia, used to kill people. Oh, that's right. They're doing it now, aren't they, in some Western countries? I forgot about that. You know, it's called volunteer, but, you know, they're sort of encouraging you if you got doubts. So this is the problem where we're in the ethical foundation of the West has completely and utterly collapsed. The East is looking at us and laughing. And I don't blame them. They're looking and saying, those people have lost the plot, because we have lost the plot. And everybody's sitting there going, oh well, I can't change anything. Well, you can. You can get off your fat ass and you can start emailing and sending messages to those politicians and telling them you're going to be putting a massive blowtorch under their rear end if they don't change on some of these things. Enough of you people start putting this out in your social media and creating a momentum. You know what's going to happen? These people are going to get scared and start having these conversations with your families so they realize what the hell is going on, because most of them are in dreamland. They're either playing computer games or watching Days of Our Lives or I don't know what, but they're not basically switched on what's coming and what's happening in their society. So things are really unraveling. And if we don't arrest this unravel, the consequences could be dire for all of us. I warned you about what was going to happen in the banks, in the smaller banks and all that, medium-sized banks, quite some time back. Some of you heeded that warning. Some of you didn't. Please heed this warning. Things are really going to shit. And they're moving rapidly. Things are deteriorating rapidly. I can't put it any other way. When I see central banks and certain institutions and all that running to gold, it's quite clear that the world is going to be a different place in the not too distant future. Now, you can sit with your paper money and hope for the best, but I can tell you it's not looking good. Now, can we stop it? I don't know. How many can we convince in the short amount of time we have? How much pressure can we put on? But if we don't try, we'll never know. I'd rather go down trying than not trying at all. Anyway, didn't want this to be sort of depressing. Things are not looking good. Yes, I know. But I want you to think optimistically. I may discuss problems, but down deep, in the long term, I'm optimistic that things eventually sort themselves out, even if there's a lot of mayhem in the immediate. I'm just hoping we don't do too much mayhem and then we unravel things too much, and the cost, even though whoever survives after that, it may be a better future for them. We don't want to basically end up losing too much, and there's that potential risk. But it's up to us. We need to become proactive citizens. To be a citizen is to be involved in your society. I wish the only people that actually had the right to citizenship were the ones that basically contributed, the ones service of different types, because currently most of the society thinks that they can just get a blank check. Oh, that's right. Janet Yellen will print one for you. Yeah. We need to put a blowtorch under these people. We need to change the direction. Fighting over the debt ceiling, fighting over where money is being allocated or stuff like that, it's not going to solve the problem. When you've got a shrinking amount, fighting over which dollar goes here or there, that's a zero-sum game. Nobody wins that. But, politicians, the media love the negativity. it just breeds tribalism, hating each other and all that. It's your fault. Oh no, it's your fault. It's all of their fault. And it's also our fault for allowing this to get out of hand and for us sitting back and doing nothing about it. It's all our faults. We need to step up as responsible citizens. We need to inform our friends and relatives. And at the same time, we need to get them to act. And we need to act as well before things really unravel. And then it's really hard to put Humpty Dumpty back again, together again, as they say. Yes. Anyway, that's about it. You've got your orders, meat militia, as Bart would say. Yes, you've got your orders. So put them into action, or otherwise I'll organise Ted with little Tassie Devil to come over and sort yous out. Anyway, see yous.